The station did not breathe exactly, but it did something close enough that Callum Reeve had stopped noticing it after the first 2 weeks. A pressure cycle ran through the atmospheric systems every 4 hours, a barely perceptible shift in the air that the Dominion engineers had calibrated, he was told, to mimic the respiratory rhythm of the home world, a planet he had never visited, in a system so far from Earth's sun that light itself took 11 years to make the trip. He had noted this in his first report to the Bureau. He had noted it in a tone of careful professional interest. What he had not noted, because the Bureau's reporting templates did not include a field for it, was that he found it oddly comforting, like living inside something alive. The Sorn Dominion's primary station was called, in the official diplomatic registry, Orbital Platform Vaelith Sorn Prime, which was the kind of name that committees produced when no one in the room wanted to be the person who suggested something interesting. Everyone who actually lived and worked on it called it the seat, because the Empress sat here and therefore everything that mattered happened here, and because the Dominion, as a culture, had a talent for compressing enormous significance into very small words. Callum had arrived 8 months ago on a Bureau transit vessel that smelled of recycled air, and the particular institutional despair of long-haul diplomatic transport. He had one standard-issue luggage container, a secondary bag he used for the translation equipment, and a third bag that he told customs was personal reading material, and which contained, among other things, 17 different teas he had been told he would not be able to source in Dominion space. This had turned out to be incorrect. The station's quartermaster, an extremely efficient woman named Sareth, had sourced 12 of the 17 within a week, which Callum had found impressive, and had presented them to him with an expression suggesting that she found his relief disproportionate, which he could not entirely argue with. He had been briefed, before departure, by 4 different Bureau departments. Cultural liaison had told him to observe and to document, and under no circumstances to offer personal opinions on Dominion policy, which was standard. Security had told him that the Empress had approved his posting personally, which was not standard, and had declined to explain what it meant. Psychological services had told him to maintain his journaling habit, which they had recommended 2 postings ago, and which he had initially resisted on the grounds that he was fine, a claim that psychological services had received with the kind of gentle professional skepticism that meant they had seen his personnel file. Protocol had given him a document 400 pages long about correct address, correct posture, correct use of silence, because silence, in the Dominion court, was not empty but structured, a formal language with its own grammar that took years to read fluently. He had read all 400 pages on the transit. He had understood perhaps 60% of them. He had arrived at the seat and attended his first formal court session, and discovered, in real time, that understanding 60% of the protocol document was roughly equivalent to knowing how to spell the word swimming before someone throws you into the ocean. The court was not what he had expected, which was itself something he should have expected, because nothing about the Sorn Dominion was what anyone from the Bureau expected. He had expected grandeur of the cold and architectural variety, the kind that was specifically designed to make visiting dignitaries feel small. What he found was something more unsettling than that, a grandeur that was not performing. The chamber where the Empress received formal audiences was enormous and precise, and utterly indifferent to whether or not anyone was impressed by it. It had been built to function, not to intimidate, and the intimidation was simply a byproduct of being in a room where everything worked perfectly, including the woman at the center of it. He had written about that first audience for 9 pages. 6 of those pages were about the room. In his defense, the room was genuinely remarkable. The ceiling was a live feed from the station's outer sensors, calibrated and rendered so seamlessly that standing beneath it felt like standing under open space, the gas giant below filling one entire quadrant in bands of amber and rust. its storms moving in slow and ancient patterns that made human urgency feel briefly, usefully absurd. But he knew, and the journal knew, that the reason he had spent 6 pages on the room was the same reason a person describing a piece of music spends a long time on the instruments. He had written, on page 7, "The Empress is present in the way that weather is present. You do not decide whether to notice her." He had then written, "This is a professional observation." He had then written nothing else for 11 lines, which in the journal constituted a kind of honesty all its own. The notebook was encrypted. It was hidden. It was the one place in 4 star systems where Callum Reeve allowed himself to be entirely himself. And himself, it turned out, was a man who noticed things he was not supposed to notice and felt things he was not supposed to feel and wrote all of it down in careful, precise sentences. Because if he was going to be compromised, he was at least going to be articulate about it. This was, he would later reflect, not the comfort he imagined it was. The chess games had started because of a misunderstanding, which was, Callum had come to believe, how most significant things in the Dominion began. He had been waiting in the smaller reception chamber for a scheduled debrief with senior advisor Preth. A debrief that Preth, who communicated primarily through a graduated system of size, had arranged and then failed to appear for, which Callum had noted was either a test of his patience or evidence that Preth had simply forgotten, and which he privately suspected was both. The chess set was on the low table near the window. He had sat down across from it and moved a piece without thinking, the way you reach for something familiar when you are trying to look like you belong somewhere. And he had been sitting there, playing both sides of a game against himself with the focused blankness of a man pretending not to be waiting, when the Empress walked in. She had not been scheduled. Nothing in his protocol briefings covered this. He had stood immediately and managed not to knock the board over, which he counted as a diplomatic success. She had looked at the board. She had looked at him. She had sat down on the other side of the table and moved a piece, and that had been that. Preth had appeared 20 minutes later, seen what was happening, produced a sigh of such extraordinary complexity that Callum later spent an entire journal entry attempting to categorize it, and quietly left. They played on Tuesdays after that. Always in the smaller chamber, always with the 300-year-old set in black and silver, always silver for her and black for him, an arrangement that had established itself without discussion on the first day, and which Callum had chosen not to examine because some things were better left as facts than as questions. The games lasted between 40 minutes and 2 hours, depending on how severely the galaxy was misbehaving that week. And the galaxy, in his experience, maintained a fairly consistent standard of misbehavior. It was during the 3rd week of the Kalhari trade negotiations that he began to understand something he had been not understanding for quite some time. The Kalhari Compact had sent a delegation of 11, which was 3 more than protocol required, and which the Empress had registered with a very small shift of her head that Callum, by now, could read as precisely as a weather alert. The additional delegates were not diplomatic staff. They were economists, and their presence meant the compact had come not to negotiate, but to demonstrate, to lay numbers on the table the way you lay a hand of cards, confident and public, because they believed the numbers made the argument for them. It was, he wrote in the journal that evening, the kind of strategy that works extremely well against people who have not yet met Vaelith Sorn. He watched it from the side of the chamber, in his designated observer position, for 3 days. He watched her let them present. He watched her ask questions that sounded like clarifications and functioned as excavations, pulling the compact's position up by the roots while the delegation smiled and explained, not yet understanding what was being examined. He watched her, on the 4th day, propose an amended framework that incorporated 60% of the compact's stated priorities and achieved none of their actual ones. And he watched the Kalhari chief delegate accept it with an expression of genuine gratitude that did not falter for the entire duration of the signing ceremony, which meant it did not falter for 40 minutes, which was Professionally speaking, impressive. He had written about it for 8 pages. He was aware, distantly, that 8 pages was a great deal to write about a trade negotiation. He was aware of what that meant. He was choosing, with some energy, not to be aware of what that meant. What he could admit, because the journal permitted admission, was that the 8 pages were not really about the negotiation. They were about the moment on the second day when she had asked a question so precisely targeted that the Kalhari economist responsible for the figures had gone very still for 3 seconds before answering, and she had waited out those 3 seconds without moving, without expression, with the absolute unhurried patience of someone who already knew what the silence contained. He had written, "She doesn't press. She simply waits and the silence does the work, and I think that is the most efficient thing I have ever seen anyone do, and I have been watching people negotiate for 8 years, and I need to stop writing this sentence now." He had not stopped writing the sentence. The sentence went on for another 4 lines. The Tuesday after the Kalhari signing, they played chess. He was distracted in a way that he hoped read as thoughtful and suspected Reed as distracted. She played silver to a position he didn't understand for 3 moves, and then on the 4th move he understood it completely, all at once, the way you understand a joke in a language you're still learning delayed, and then suddenly, and then with the full force of what you'd been missing. He looked up. She was watching him understand it. She looked not triumphant, something quieter than that. Something that did not have a clean professional word and therefore belonged, like all such things, in the journal. He moved his black rook. She tilted her head, a fraction of a degree. Outside the window, the gas giant turned in its 11,000-year argument with itself, vast and unresolved, and Callum Reeve sat across from the most dangerous woman in 4-star systems and began to lose a chess game in a way that felt, with a specificity he was not prepared to examine, like something he was choosing. The day had been the kind of long that had nothing to do with hours. It had begun with a protocol review that ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time, because 2 of the Dominion's junior cultural ministers had a disagreement about the correct order of processional flags for the upcoming state memorial. A disagreement that was technically about flags, and actually about something that had happened between their respective departments in a resource allocation meeting 14 months ago, and which Callum had sat through with the practiced stillness of a man who has learned that the fastest way through someone else's argument is to become very quiet and wait for it to exhaust itself. Then there had been the briefing on Dominion funeral customs, which was genuinely interesting and which he had paid close attention to, partly because it would be professionally necessary, and partly because the customs were strange and layered, and told him things about the Dominion's relationship with time that no diplomatic file had managed to convey. Then there had been the communique from the Bureau. The Bureau communiques arrived in his diplomatic feed with a sound like a polite cough, which was either a coincidence of interface design or a very accurate metaphor for how the Bureau communicated in general. This one had required 2 hours to answer, not because the content was complex, but because the Bureau had asked, in the careful language of institutions that want information without wanting to be seen wanting it, whether he had any preliminary observations on the possibility of extending the cultural liaison posting. They had asked this in 400 words. He had answered in 6, which were nothing to report at this time, and which were, he reflected as he sent them, the most precise lie he had ever told. He was tired when he got back to his quarters. The kind of tired that had a specific shape, not physical but structural, like a building that has been holding up more than it was designed to hold and is beginning to notice. The corridor outside his door was empty, which was standard at this hour, the station's internal lighting having shifted to its evening register, the blue-white of the day cycle giving way to something warmer that the Dominion, with characteristic efficiency, had calibrated to ease the cognitive transition between formal function and rest. He had stopped appreciating this 4 months ago and had started appreciating it again recently, For reasons he was not recording in the journal under that specific heading. The door read his biometrics and opened. The lights were at 60%. Empress Vaelith Sorn was sitting in his reading chair. His journal was open on the desk. What happened next, in terms of Callum's internal experience, was not something that had a clean, linear description. It was more like several things occurring in parallel that his brain, operating under sudden and extreme load, attempted to process in sequence and could not. There was recognition here in his room. There was the journal open, on his desk, not in the panel, not encrypted, open. There was a sound his cardiovascular system made that he was fairly certain was not medically standard. And then, cutting through all of it with the precision of something that had no business being present in this moment, there was the panel. He looked at it. The wall panel was closed. Visibly, completely, correctly closed, seated flush in the wall with no indication that it had been opened, which was impossible, because the journal had been inside it, and the journal was currently on his desk, which meant the panel had been opened and then reclosed, and he was standing in his doorway staring at a wall panel as though the wall panel was the issue, as though the wall panel was the thing requiring his immediate professional attention. And he could feel that this was not the correct prioritization of the situation, and he could not stop doing it. She was watching him look at it. He looked at the journal. He looked at her. He looked at the panel again. The panel remained closed and unhelpful. He said, "That panel was sealed." The words came out with perfect clarity and absolutely no value. They addressed nothing important. They implied, to any reasonable listener, that his primary concern in this moment was the structural integrity of a hidden compartment, rather than the evidence of his entire interior life, currently sitting open on his desk in front of the woman it was primarily about. He was aware of this. He said it anyway, because his brain had allocated the available resources elsewhere and speech was operating on backup power. She did not answer. She looked at him with the expression he could not read, the one that had appeared in the journal 3 times and generated progressively longer entries each time he encountered it. Her hair was moving. The faint, involuntary shift that he had learned was tied to emotional processing. The one thing about her she could not fully govern, and it was moving more than he had seen it move before. Her inner irises had shifted to deep copper. She had been calculating something for a long time. He crossed the room and sat down, not in the reading chair, which was occupied by the Empress, which was a sentence he would spend considerable time with later, but on the edge of the desk, because his legs had made a quiet executive decision about how much longer they were prepared to perform normalcy. She let him sit. She looked at him with the copper-iris stillness of someone who has chosen their ground and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for the other person to reach it. She told him she had read the journal. He said that he had gathered as much. She told him she had questions. He told her that he imagined she did, and was briefly proud of this sentence, which was technically meaningless and yet conveyed, he felt, a kind of composed acknowledgement that was the closest thing to dignity available to him at this precise moment. There was a silence. The atmospheric system ran its pressure cycle, the 4-hour breath of a world 11 light-years away, and the station held them both in its careful and indifferent orbit, and somewhere far below the amber storms moved in the patterns they had been moving in since before anything alive had been looking at them. She asked him which entry he would most prefer she hadn't read. He said immediately, without strategy or hesitation or any of the professional machinery he had spent 8 years maintaining, page 43. She looked at him. She said, "That was not the entry I expected you to say." He said, "I know." She closed the journal. She did not give it back. She stood and the room rearranged itself around her the way rooms did, and she walked to the door, and at the door she stopped and she said, without turning, "Page 43 was my favorite too." Then she was gone, and Callum sat on the edge of his desk in the 60% light and did not move for a very long time, and the journal sat closed on the desk in front of him, and outside the window the 11,000-year storm continued its ancient and enormous business, completely unconcerned, as it had always been, with anything as small and catastrophic as this. He did not sleep. This was not a decision so much as a fact that his body presented to him around midnight, and which he accepted with the resignation of a man who has stopped arguing with facts. He sat at his desk instead, and he wrote. The entry began practically, because this was what he did when things exceeded the boundaries of what he could hold still. He wrote toward the edges of them, methodically, the way you walk the perimeter of a room in the dark, hands out, learning the shape of it by what you find. He wrote what had happened in sequence without editorial comment, which lasted approximately 4 sentences before editorial comment became structurally unavoidable. He wrote, "She came herself. Not an advisor, not the security chief who has been standing 6 inches closer to me than necessary for 3 weeks in a way I have chosen to interpret as friendliness, and which I am now reconsidering. She came herself, and she stayed, and she waited. And the Empress of the Sorn Dominion does not wait for anything she has not already decided is worth waiting for. And I am writing this sentence instead of the sentence I actually mean, because the sentence I actually mean has been sitting at the end of 8 months of other sentences, and I have been walking around it the way you walk around something you are not ready to look at directly." He wrote the sentence, "I am in love with her." He sat back and looked at it. It was 11 words. It was the most accurate thing he had written since he arrived on the seat, and he had written, by his last count, approximately 90,000 words. He left it where it was and kept going. He wrote about the chess games, the way she moved her silver knight and waited for him to understand it. He wrote about the Kelhari negotiation and the 3 seconds of silence and what her patience looked like from a room's length away. He wrote about the jacket, the state dinner, the atmospheric failure, the gesture he had made without thinking and which she had accepted without comment and which had generated at the time. A 4-page entry he had labeled Professional Incident, Cultural Sensitivity Review Required, which was possibly the most dishonest heading in the history of the journal. A document he had specifically designed to contain no dishonest headings. He wrote, "I told psychological services I was fine. I have been telling psychological services I am fine for 8 years. I am beginning to think they have known for 8 years that fine is a word people use when they have agreed to stop looking too closely at something, and that their recommendation to maintain the journal was not, in fact, about professional equilibrium. I think they knew the journal would eventually make me look closely. I think I owe them an apology and possibly a formal commendation." Around 3 in the morning, he drafted in his head a bureau communication. It began, "Cultural liaison mission, experiencing significant unanticipated developments of a personal nature, requiring framework reconsideration." He got as far as recommending an emergency review of interspecies diplomatic proximity protocols before he started laughing, quietly, alone in his room, in the way that exhausted people laugh when the alternative is something they don't have vocabulary for. The laugh surprised him. He stayed surprised because it was easier than the other things that were available, and he had a practical relationship with ease. She returned in the morning. An hour before the formal court day began, his door announced a visitor with the specific tone it used for someone carrying a Dominion Senior Authorization Code, and he opened it and she was there, not in state dress, holding the journal. She set it on the table. She sat down across from him, not in the reading chair but at the table across from his own chair, as though this were a chess game, as though they were going to negotiate something, which he supposed they were. He sat down. The gas giant was visible in the lower quadrant of the window, amber and rust, the storms moving in their slow, enormous patience. He had stopped seeing it 4 months ago. He was seeing it now. She said, "Your assignment ends in 4 months." He said, "Yes." She said, "The Bureau will assign you elsewhere." He said, "Yes." She looked at him with the copper irises and the hair that moved the way it moved when she could not entirely govern it, and she said, I have extended assignments before. I have never done it without formal documentation that satisfied the Bureau's operational criteria. She paused. She said, I am finding this morning that I can construct documentation of considerable persuasiveness when sufficiently motivated. He looked at her across the table. This woman who had terrified 3 empires and negotiated treaties that made hardened diplomats question their career choices and come herself, to a cultural attaché's quarters to read a journal hidden behind a sealed wall panel. And he said, because the journal had taught him that honesty, once you started, was very difficult to partially practice. I don't know what this is, she said. Neither do I, he said. I want to note for the record that this is genuinely alarming. One of us is supposed to be the most dangerous woman in 4-star systems. She looked at him for a moment, and he saw it again. What he had seen on move 5 of the second chess game, what he had seen at the state dinner when he handed her his jacket, and she looked at him before taking it, what he had been writing around for